The National Portrait Gallery in London is home to the most extensive collection of portraits anywhere in the world. From the 16th century to the present day, these works tell the story of portraiture through the ages. The greatest painters and photographers, the most iconic subjects. In this series, I've been granted unprecedented behind-the-scenes access as the gallery prepares to reopen its doors after 3 years, having completed a once-in-a-generation refurbishment. So far, I've looked at how portraiture became its own genre of art, eventually leading to the development of large studios overseen by European painters like Anthony van Dyck and Peter Lely. In this episode, I'll be exploring how portraiture came on leaps and bounds in the 18th and 19th century. We'll be introduced to some big characters, the British masters, Hogarth, Gainsborough, and Reynolds. We'll discover the unusual story behind portraits of much-loved writers, the Bronte sisters, and find out how one invention, the camera, changed portraiture forever. It's all too easy to overlook the cultural jewels on our doorstep. Out of all of the galleries in the UK, for me, London's National Portrait Gallery has always been one of my favourites. The collection includes over 250,000 works, making it one of the largest in the world. While that can be shown online, only a fraction can be on physical display at any one time. Resident curators have the enviable, or unenviable, job of deciding which works deserve wall space. One of those curators is Lucy Peltz. Lucy, it's lovely to meet you. Your role covers such a large area, and I know that the gallery holdings are very deep in this area. So my first question ahead of the reopening is, how on earth do you decide what to put on display?
Well, it's not just me making the decisions. I've been working with a team of colleagues, with conservators, but also doing a lot of visitor consultation. But how do I decide? Well, we're looking for the key stories, trying to make portraiture and British history engaging, accessible, relevant to the widest audiences.
And you said that word relevant, and I think this is a brilliant painting to be looking at, because for me, Hogarth is someone who very much sort of dominated his age. It's almost like the age of Hogarth, but he's so resonant today. I mean, he's a great satirist. I mean, he's just got such a great mind for people.
He was a great storyteller, and he did have an incredible eye for people and relationships, but he was actually quite a political animal. He's particularly got a critical eye for corruption, stupidity, venality, and materiality. He'd seen poverty as a child, and he knew he never wanted to experience poverty himself again, but he also had an eye on the underclass.
It's a curious painting, and I know there's some things about this painting that not everybody can see.
So he's presenting himself at home with a soft cap on instead of his wig, and he's at work painting a canvas on an easel. We can see from the outline on the canvas that this is Thalia, the muse of comedy in the classical tradition, and Hogarth is presenting himself as the leading painter, in fact the only painter really, of comic history painting, a genre that he created and called his modern moral subjects. But there's more to this portrait, and we know that from X-rays. Importantly, there was a live model on a dais. And then in the corner, this is the bit, of course, we all love, is a dog, his pug dog. So Hogarth loved his pug. And,
so he's so contemporary. We love pugs.
Yeah, we love pugs now. He was the original pug man. And the pug has cocked its leg and it's peeing on a pile of canvases. And we are supposed to understand those canvases to be the sorts of works by either the old masters or by European painters who Hogarth decried as picture jobbers from abroad, and he felt that their presence in the art market and the popularity of their work and their influence was ruining the opportunities for native-born British artists. And Hogarth and his friend and colleague Hayman were the leading influencers in the development of what was called the British School. And together they kind of set up the art world that became the Royal Academy and still exists. But the key thing was to find opportunities to show their work. For all artists, they needed to be seen.
So he's just made such an extraordinary contribution. I mean, all the artists working today in London owe him a debt of gratitude. And it strikes me that he's also a perfect bridge to the next generation, people like Reynolds and Gainsborough. Can we go and look at those next?
Sure.
So, Lucy, two fascinating characters enter the scene. We've got Reynolds and Gainsborough. Tell me about these paintings.
Well, they're both really important self-portraits. The gallery has a lot of self-portraits, but I would say that the Reynolds self-portrait over there is probably one of our top 10.
Absolutely. I mean, this is amazing.
It's totally unusual, and everything about that portrait marks Reynolds' intention to make a splash. And he's young. He's about 19, 20.
He looks really young.
Yeah, he's got that kind of slight gaucheness about him, but even then, there's nothing gauche about this boy from Devon. Reynolds never really wanted to paint portraits. He wanted to paint history painting, which was the highest, most valued type of work of art in the hierarchy of genres that was handed down through the continental academic system. Gainsborough didn't want to paint portraits either. There's some great quotes. He said, "Damn these people with their faces. Why can't they leave me alone?" Later on, he talks about how he just wants to go off into some quiet village and paint landscapes, as he called them, quite sweet, and play his viol de gamba.
It's remarkable to think that Reynolds and Gainsborough, you know, here you have an artist who would rather have been a history painter, and here you have one who would rather have been a landscape painter, and yet they're producing these extraordinary portraits that really stay with us. Why do we have so many portraits in this period, then?
This is the period in which British art world burgeons, the middling classes burgeon, but we have such a strong class system in the 18th century with the aristocracy and the royal family at the top. Everyone's desperate to appear better than they are. So portraits are being painted that flatter people and position their status through their clothes or their settings. And there's an incredible demand for portraiture. And both these artists are incredibly innovative within that wrapper.
I suppose we've got a lot to be grateful for because Reynolds and Gainsborough didn't want to necessarily be portrait artists only. They really pushed at the edges of portraiture. You know, they're injecting other things into it. And I guess also maybe there's a rivalry. You know, you've got to have the best, most innovative portraits to get the best commissions.
I mean, there are moments when we can detect some rivalry because Gainsborough gets most of the court commissions from the 1770s and 1780s, but otherwise they operated in very different spheres. Gainsborough bases his career in Bath. He's the leading portrait painter in Bath, and he's getting commissions from people who have gone to Bath for their summer holiday. Reynolds is much more based in London. He's busy thinking about ways to be innovative and to introduce the art of the past, the old masters, into his work so that he's got new poses, different compositions, and he's much more innovative. In fact, one of the things that Gainsborough says with admiration is, damn him, how various he is.
So around this time, the Royal Academy is founded, very famously by Reynolds. Gainsborough's also a Royal Academician. I mean, they must have been there, surely, with all the other Royal Academicians, jostling for the best spaces on the wall.
That definitely would have happened every year until 1774, when Gainsborough fell out with the Royal Academy over the positions of his paintings, and he basically insists that he will never show at the Royal Academy again, and he doesn't.
Wow.
He has his own exhibition space on Pall Mall at his house in Schomburg House, and it becomes part of the social round. You know, people went to exhibitions. Exhibitions were a new thing. It was exciting. Art was exciting.
Reynolds and Gainsborough are absolute giants of British art history. Their paintings fill these hallowed halls. They were both founding members of the Royal Academy. And yet we begin to see a different picture when we peel back the layers. They had petty rivalries. They were jealous of one another's careers. Reynolds gets to choose where his pictures go first, and Gainsborough's in this sort of eternal huff, refuses to ever show there again. So I think it's absolutely fascinating that these self-portraits lead us down this journey of discovery to realise that these are mere mortals as well. They were flesh and blood. They were trying to carve out a space for themselves as newly professionalised artists in this very different age of portrait painting. As the National Portrait Gallery begins a new chapter in its illustrious history, I'm looking at the story the collection tells. I've just seen how Thomas Gainsborough and Joshua Reynolds became synonymous with portraiture in the 18th century. Around this time, two other founding members of the Royal Academy were challenging conventions in the art world. Mary Moser and Angelica Kauffman aren't household names today, but they probably should be, because they were highly regarded and respected artists when the Royal Academy was founded in 1768. Curator Sarah Molden is going to tell me more about these pioneering women. Sarah, I'm so excited to be in this room. It's potent with energy. Not only is it a sort of temporary restoration studio, but I know you've got big plans for it.
We have. As you say, it is a pop-up conservation studio at the moment, but it's about to transform. And we're going to take visitors back to the 18th century and show them what it was like to go to an 18th century exhibition space. And it's going to be hung from floor to ceiling with portraits. Portraits are going to be everywhere. Your eyes are going to be flickering over the different surface textures. There's going to be different faces, some you recognise, some you won't have met before.
I love this idea of evoking the great tradition of those exhibitions, a bit like the Royal Academy. And here we have two very fascinating Royal Academicians. Tell me about these paintings.
Yes, so we've got two trailblazers of the art world in Britain in the 18th century. They are two of the founding 36 members of the Royal Academy, which was dominated by men at the time. So here we've got a self-portrait of the painter Angelica Kauffman, who specialised in portraiture and history painting. And on the right, we've got a portrait of Mary Moser, who was a flower painter. And this portrait was made by her friend and society portraitist, George Romney.
Yeah, I'm sure some people are surprised, Sarah, to know that two of the founding members of the Royal Academy were women artists. I mean, Kauffman is spectacularly famous in her day. She's internationally renowned, isn't she?
She is. In her day, she was one of the most famous faces. She was a celebrity. She was very interested in cultivating her own image. So she painted many self-portraits, like this one. And you can see here she's holding her drawing board or portfolio, and that thing in her hand is a port crayon, so that held her charcoal. So she's showing herself here as an artist at work, and she's brandishing the tools of her trade. That actually made her extremely rich. She was one of the most well-paid artists, not only female artists, but artists in the late 18th century British art world.
So this is painted by Romney, who I've heard of. You know, he's a very established artist, and so we know, therefore, that she's, you know, an important subject to be painted by him, and, you know, she's a Royal Academician, she's the real deal. This is my confession time. I'm afraid to say I hadn't heard of Mary Moser before.
Well, you would be in very good company. As you say, we've heard of Angelica Kauffman, but Moser has really sort of fallen out of art history, as many women have done and continue to do. She was a flower painter, so a painter of still lives, and that kind of genre doesn't find much favour nowadays, although it was very popular in the 18th century. So it's partly that reason, but also, as I say, you know, these are really successful women artists in their time. Yes, they're pushing boundaries and they have a real fight on their hands, and it's certainly not the norm, but it is the norm that women artists don't always make it into the art history books.
So, although they're Royal Academicians, it's not as if they have an easy time of it. Things are still pretty hostile for them. You know, I know for a fact they wouldn't have been allowed in the famous drawing room at the Royal Academy.
Totally. So they weren't allowed in, and in a very famous portrait by Johann Zoffany, the German-born artist, also a Royal Academician, he paints a sort of roll call of all the Royal Academicians, and there's nude male models in this painting. Angelica Kauffman and Mary Moser are there, but they're there virtually, in the right-hand corner, in quite strange painted portraits. And therein lies one of the many tensions that arise when the Royal Academy is founded in 1768.
So I assume then that the art of these women would have been exhibited on the walls of the Royal Academy in those big sort of salon shows that you're going to be emulating, you know, with Gainsborough and Reynolds. So they're trying to get good positions too, right?
Absolutely. Women did exhibit at the Royal Academy. They could do so as amateurs. They could do so as professionals, but it was not the norm. After Mary Moser's death in 1819, it takes a further 168 years that takes us up to the year 1936 for a woman to become a Royal Academician, and that's Dame Laura Knight, and we have some wonderful works by her in the collection. And it just shows the continuation of that marginalisation of women artists from not only the British art world, but art history more generally.
Whether we recognise the names or not today, this journey has turned up lots of portrait painters who were highly regarded in their time. Within the National Portrait Gallery's collection, there are other works, not by professional artists, but by gifted amateurs. These men and women captured likenesses that otherwise would have been lost forever. And that's why today we cherish these pieces. I can't wait to chat to curator Rab McGibbon about one particularly famous example from the 19th century. Rab, there are not many paintings on display at the National Portrait Gallery that look like this. Tell me about this painting.
This is a unique and incredible portrait of the three Bronte sisters, showing from left to right, Anne, Emily and Charlotte, painted by their brother, Branwell. He's only about 17 when he produces this.
It's a fascinating object for so many reasons, not just because you can actually kind of go back in time and see these three women who are now household names just as young girls at home. This is before the fame.
Absolutely, yeah. It's at least 10 years before they're writing their sort of mature works, but it is significant that they're standing around a table with books placed on it.
So Branwell's only 17 when he paints this, which is the equivalent of today someone having one of their, you know, A-level coursework pictures hang on the walls of the National Portrait Gallery. Does he become an artist? Is this the beginning of a career?
So each of the children were taught painting by a local artist. Branwell saw it as a real opportunity. He had an interest in taking it up and did try to live for a year as a portrait painter, but it wasn't a great success, and he returned to the parsonage.
I suppose because we know how important these three women are, the painting takes on this other kind of life. And there's this kind of ghostly shape here, and I'm wondering what that is.
So it's almost certain that this is a self-portrait by Branwell Bronte. It's unfinished, even though the rest of the painting isn't done to a very high degree of finish. It's only a couple of sort of marks that can be seen under sort of ultraviolet light of the face. He was clearly unsatisfied with his bit of the portrait and painted a column right over the top.
I mean, this painting is not in good condition. Talk to me about its life. What happened to it? It seems like it would have been an important family heirloom. How did it end up like this?
So, as is well known about the Bronte sisters, that they become famous in 1847 with the publication of Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey. And tragically, within a year, first of all, Branwell, who, unlike his sisters, lacked the sort of discipline and drive to really create an incredible career for himself, and sadly became effectively an alcoholic. He was the first of this set of siblings to die from probably bronchitis at the end of 1848. Emily follows suit a month later, and in the next year, Anne dies trying to recover from bronchitis in Scarborough. This leaves just Charlotte. She marries her father's curate, who's probably one of the few men around who isn't her dad, and less than a year later, tragically, she dies during pregnancy.
So what happens to the painting if all the siblings have gone?
After Charlotte's death, her husband takes it with him to Ireland and folds it up and hides it on top of a cupboard. And it's in this condition that the painting came to the gallery in 1914. And an extraordinary decision was made not to try and tidy up and restore it, but to preserve it exactly as it was when it was found on top of that cupboard. It's a unique record of these sisters. It's the only portrait that shows them all.
I mean, it's an incredible historical document, and I suppose the decision to leave the scars intact tells us something about its journey through history, and it makes it all the more exciting for the viewer.
Absolutely. When this work was unveiled in 1914, it was a front-page news story, and it was reported that there was a small siege of people trying to get into the gallery to see it.
Well, I can understand why people flock to the National Portrait Gallery to see this. I mean, it's a great story. You want to come face to face with these fantastic heroes of literature.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that the only other comparable portrait to this in the gallery, the Bronte sisters painted in their sort of youth by their brother Branwell, is a beautifully intimate drawing of Jane Austen by her sister Cassandra. They had a similarly intense friendship between siblings as the Brontes. The drawing was made in about 1810, so a generation before this painting. But just as Branwell's portrait captures this intense relationship between siblings, Cassandra's drawing of Jane Austen does exactly the same.
And I think that's why it's so special they're here at the National Portrait Gallery, because this place is as equally about the sitters as it is about the artworks, and so they're perfect examples of that. A painting like this demonstrates the unique strength of the National Portrait Gallery's collection. They can acquire work outside of the boundaries of art history. It's not just a fascinating historic document, it's an insight, it's a familial portrait, and it says so much about the Bronte sisters. The visitors who flood back to the National Portrait Gallery in a matter of weeks will do so carrying hundreds of portraits of friends and family on their phones. Centuries ago, there was the same desire to keep images close. Handheld portraits, known as miniatures, became a sensation in Victorian Britain. Art historian Emma Rutherford has researched this intriguing aspect of portrait making.
Portrait miniatures start in the 1520s, and they really come from manuscript illumination. So a portrait miniature isn't actually defined by its size, it's actually defined by its materials. So the earliest portrait miniatures are painted in the same way as an illuminated manuscript. They're watercolour on vellum or parchment. And then from the early 18th century, they start to be painted on ivory. And really the best way to think about a portrait miniature in terms of its importance is the image that you've got on your mobile phone. It's something that people wanted to look at every day, so they're incredibly personal items. So when portrait miniatures were first invented in the 1520s, the people commissioning miniatures were very much tied to the court, to the royal court, and they were something that only really nobility would commission. They were very, very expensive. They were only painted by very few artists. And then, as time goes on, they become much more democratic. Lots and lots of people are commissioning miniatures. You even have people who you could sort of describe as cold callers, knocking on people's doors saying, would you like your family painted in miniatures? So portrait miniatures are normally commissioned at the most important stages in people's lives. So normally, when people got married, they were commissioned between husband and wife. Sadly, when somebody died, they're very much part of the mourning process. Or, for example, if you were an officer in the army, if you got a new rank, that was a time to get a miniature commissioned as well. So I think visitors to the National Portrait Gallery, I would really encourage them to go and look at one particular portrait miniature because it's incredibly special. It was painted by a female artist called Sarah Biffin around 1825, and they'll notice in this self-portrait that she's painted that she has her brush attached to the sleeve of her dress, and that's because she is painting this portrait with her mouth. She's born in Somerset in 1784 without arms or legs, a condition known as phocomelia. And initially at the age of 20, she starts touring with what is basically a circus and becomes a sort of freak show act. She's taught herself to sew with her mouth, and she then teaches herself to paint. But this young woman is incredibly ambitious, and she wants to become a professional portrait miniaturist. She wants to join the ranks of professional artists in London. So in 1821, she sets up her studio in Bond Street, a really prestigious address, And then a few years later, she paints this self-portrait, which is now in the National Portrait Gallery. She's showing herself as a fashionable woman and a professional artist. So she has the paintbrush sewn onto her sleeve so that she can easily reach it with her mouth. She has her pot of water, because obviously she's painting in watercolour, and the painting slope in front of her. She's also looking highly fashionable with this wonderful hat, and it's just so delicately and remarkably painted.
The story of portraiture has had so many twists and turns. In the National Portrait Gallery's collection, it starts with monarchs showing their subjects who they are. By the 19th century, it's still about elite power structures, but it's also about the everyday, the personal. No look at 19th century art would be complete without these guys, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This is a portrait of John Everett Millais by his friend, the artist William Holman Hunt. And there were a few of these artists who were actually art students that came up with this really revolutionary movement in art history. They didn't agree with the grand classical principles of the Royal Academy. And actually, to find something new, they went all the way back to the past. They called themselves the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood because they liked the art that came before Raphael, the beauty and the simplicity and the truth to nature of the Renaissance period and before. What we've got here, though, is a very intimate work. The pre-Raphaelites were friends, they were in the same social circle, they sat around and talked about art and art's place in society, and they would make portraits of one another as gifts to exchange. So actually, these were designed to be seen by a very small audience, an audience of their peers. And when I look at works like this, I really love it because it's an artist showing off to another artist, and that's what a great portrait can be sometimes. It can just be a fantastic gift, and it gives us this tiny little window into this really big moment in art history. Around here, it's safe to say that 1856 is a bit of a landmark moment in the history of portrait making. The opening of the National Portrait Gallery, the first of its kind anywhere in the world, recognised the importance of portraiture to the Victorians. I'm in the library of the MPG to meet Chief Curator Alison Smith and find out more about those formative years. Alison, tell me exactly how the gallery came to exist.
The gallery came into existence in the 1850s. This was a time when the British Empire was at its height. There's a lot of patriotism around and a feeling that we must commemorate the great Britons, past and present. The person who spearheaded the foundation of the National Portrait Gallery was a politician called Philip Henry Stanhope. He was also an amateur historian, and he was backed by the historian Thomas Babington Macaulay and the biographer and essayist Thomas Carlyle.
Wow, OK, so the formation of this place, which is this extraordinary vestibule of art, isn't by art historians, it's by people principally concerned with biography and history. So that really tells you something about the DNA of this place. I mean, it's very much about people, isn't it?
Exactly. Biography and history is more important than art. So you could say we have some terrible portraits in this collection, but the sitters are fascinating.
Yeah.
So you take the portrait of the Brontes, for instance, not in very good condition, but it's an icon. And this is the key thing. People come here to understand about biography, history, the lives of fascinating people in the past, right through to the present day.
So it's a sort of uniquely British concept, then, this idea of a portrait gallery?
It is, because it's the first portrait gallery in the world, and certainly the largest. And I think this is because if you think of art making, going back to, say, the 17th, 18th century, portraiture was the #1 genre. All the landed gentry, the aristocrats, they wanted their portraits painted. And artists were always complaining, oh, no one's interested in history painting, I want to paint landscapes, but all they wanted more and more bloody portraits. So that was sort of the idea. But I think it's also because people love their families, they love their sort of nation, their societies, their clubs. So I think the whole way sort of, British politics developed, it was really conducive to this particular art form.
So this is Sir George Scharf, who, this is his legacy. I mean, he's the first director of the National Portrait Gallery. I read that he used to live above the original gallery, almost like he was sort of like living above a shop.
That's right. He's really our sort of, founding father. We revere George Sharp here. His portrait's in the archive and library, and this is a self-portrait, a wonderful watercolour, and you can see him looking out at us with a curious, inquiring mind. So when the MPG first opened, it was down the road in Great George Street in Westminster, and George lived there with his mother and his aunt. Very cramped conditions, and the portraits were hung all over. And he'd sit in his bed and he would draw the portraits.
And could the public come in even at that
public
early
could
stage?
come in, yes, but it was in a townhouse. And you can imagine, because, he started collecting works, he had a great knowledge of the history of art, of private collections. It soon outgrew the premises. But he was responsible for the early collection, putting it together, caring for it. And also he sort of championed the establishment of the National Portrait Gallery when it moved to St. Martin's Place. And if you look at this book here, this little tiny sketch, is his design for a monogram for the new National Portrait Gallery. So he sort of, brings the different initials together into this lovely design and pattern, which is actually on the mosaic at the entrance facing St. Martin's Place. And for the reopening, we've rediscovered this in a way, and we've tried to represent it as our sort of, logo. So it's part of the new brand for the gallery.
That's nice.
So we're looking back to the past, to our foundations, and also to sort of, open again to the public and to present the new National Portrait Gallery.
Yeah, it shows a real human side of this place, which is so much about people. You think of these museums set in stone, these Acts of Parliament, these great lofty ideals. So actually, you look back and it's a kind of a really passionate bloke with a fountain pen doing a monogram and a drawing of a building.
Exactly.
It's so charming.
It is, yeah.
And I think that charming sentiment is still always at the National Portrait Gallery. I mean, it really feels like a place which is run by people who are intensely passionate about this subject.
It's about people. All these lives, these incredible stories, and people in all their imperfections.
The history of the National Portrait Gallery is one of continual evolution. The second half of the 19th century saw a revolution that would affect not just science and industry, but go right to the heart of portraiture. This would be the age of the camera. The National Portrait Gallery is preparing to reopen its doors after 3 years. I've been given unprecedented access to the collection to tell the story of portraiture. From the Victorian era onwards, this story would include the new concept of the photographic portrait. There's a danger that we look at early photographs from the 1800s and 1900s as antiques, but in fact, it's important to remember quite how cutting edge those images were. Initially, photographs were rejected by the National Portrait Gallery. Now, they're a vital part of the collection. This includes the work of Antoine Claudet and Richard Beard, two photographers at the centre of a revolution in portrait making. Like Gainsborough and Reynolds, they were desperate to prove their superiority. In the underground stores of the National Portrait Gallery, photography curator Claire Freestone is going to tell me about them. Claire, I'm almost trying not to breathe because I'm in the presence of something so unusual. These are the earliest photographs taken in this country. Who created them and when?
So these were all made in the 1840s. So you probably know that in 1839, photography was announced to the world. Louis Daguerre patented that in France, and it only took a couple of years, actually, for Richard Beard to set up the very first photographic studio in London. And then within a few months, Antoine Claudet had set up another studio very close to the gallery in Adelaide Street.
So these are daguerreotypes, so not at all like me taking a photo on my phone today. A very complicated and revolutionary invention.
It really was. It has been called the most important invention of the 19th century, actually, because it actually changed the way we think about ourselves, about portraiture, about identity, and suddenly there were these amazing tiny miniature cells captured.
So you mentioned that it hadn't actually taken very long for Beard and Claudet to come to London and set up these studios. Was there a sort of rivalry? Were they trying to ensure that everybody went to their studio?
Exactly. Yeah, so Daguerre's patent was actually bought by the French government, and it was meant to be given to the world. But Daguerre had managed to license the patent to the UK, and Richard Beard purchased the patent so that he had sole rights. However, Claudet had visited Daguerre separately. He managed to set up a studio, so they were very much fierce rivals at that time.
And they're not really perfunctory, are they? I mean, they're very creative. This one here has got this amazing landscape background. It makes me sort of think of, a couple of hundred years earlier, they might have gone to an old master painter. They might have gone to Van Dyck or to Gainsborough and said, I'd love my portrait taken for the landscape, I'll pay extra. Exactly. And this is the modern equivalent of it.
It is, yeah, exactly. I think Claudet soon surpassed Beard in terms of artistic prowess, because he was the master photographer, whereas Beard had operators who worked for him, and he patented actually these amazing backdrops that obviously were modelled on painted backdrops.
So it wouldn't have been as painstaking as painting. Painting would have taken weeks, for one of those artists to make a great portrait. This probably would have taken a day. I mean, it was a lot of sitting still and a lot of equipment involved. Yeah. I imagine that the painters of this era were none too pleased to see these portraits circulating.
Exactly, yeah. I think it was a real threat to their profession. The exposure at this time would have been about 1.5 to 3 minutes, so it was still very long in terms of a photograph, but they could do several sittings each day, actually.
Can I have the great honour of being able to hold one of these?
Yes, certainly, because it's really how they catch the light that enable you to see them more clearly.
OK, this is not TV. I am genuinely terrified. I mean, it's very ambitious. It's a family. Do you think this invention allowed for a totally different set of people to have their portraits made for the first time?
It became more affordable as exposure times decreased and the sensitivity of the plates was greater. So both things combined to make it more accessible, basically. And more studios popped up around the UK.
So now every time I take a photograph, I should be thinking of Beard and Claudet because they were really responsible for bringing it to this country. So what became of them both?
So Beard, really, he was so busy defending his licence rights that eventually he became bankrupt, and I think by 1860 he was no longer in photography. Whereas Claudet won a very special prize at the Great Exhibition of 1851, and he opened that year his temple to photography. So he went on to even greater things and, to the next developments of photography, the positive-negative element that we really, is how photography developed for the next 150 years.
OK, well, great lesson to everyone today. Don't keep trying to chase all the business for yourself. Just
I think so.
Plough forward and be creative and you'll be the victor. Like the Tudor period, the 19th century was dominated by a queen. At the start of a new revolution of science and industry this time, Victoria projected stability. But there were other stories, and photography had a hand to play in capturing them. I'm going to speak to gallery advisor Hannah Cusworth about a very special item within the National Portrait Gallery collection. Hannah, this is just extraordinary. I'm so used to thinking about the Victorian era, well, I suppose principally through all of the pictures of Queen Victoria.
The many.
Yeah, these are massive paintings with big gold frames. And actually, this is a very different window into the Victorian England.
Into Victorian England, but still with a really strong connection to Queen Victoria. So the woman that we're looking at here was often described as the goddaughter of Queen Victoria. And so there is that intimate connection, although, like you said, these portraits are different because they're of black people. And I think, for me, that feels incredibly special and it's really quite rare.
So tell me all about them. I mean, this woman is just sort of directly connecting with me through the centuries on these pages.
Yeah. Her story, so Sarah Forbes Bonetta is the name that she's most often known by. She was born, we think, in 1843. In what's now Nigeria, and she's a Yoruba woman of relatively high status. Tragically, when she's about 5, there's a huge raid on her village. Her parents are killed, and she gets taken into the court of a really powerful man, King Gezo of Dahomey. While she's there, she's in a really tricky situation because it's likely that she's going to be sold as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, Britain has abolished slavery at this point, but it's still going on. French ships, Spanish ships, A guy called Frederick Forbes, who's a British naval captain, is going around trying to stop African leaders from being involved in the transatlantic slave trade. He sees Sarah and asks for her as a gift to Queen Victoria. So she comes to England and she's named Sarah as part of that process of kind of moving from West Africa to Britain. Sarah Forbes Bonetta, Forbes is the name of the guy, and Bonetta is the ship that she travels to the UK on. And pretty soon she's taken to have an audience with Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria talks about her in quite racialised terms in her diary, but she is clearly really taken by Sarah, calls her Sally, sort of adopts her then as a goddaughter, pays for her education, and is placed with a family in Gillingham in Kent, and seems to have a pretty happy childhood, obviously in the context of a really traumatic early life. And she then spends the time in Gillingham before Queen Victoria is keen to arrange a marriage for her.
And so cue these quite amazing wedding photos. So do you think that she became a bit of a celebrity in her day then? Because obviously everybody wanted to know everything that Victoria was doing. So to have this godchild, and particularly for her to have been a black godchild, must have been something people paid attention to.
They really did. And we get the sense from the source record that there was a huge amount of fascination in Sarah because of her blackness. And she was sort of seen as an exceptional black person, very intelligent, very sort of genteel. And the wedding, the discussion around the wedding is a huge amount of press. And it's sort of discussed in these terms of Britain is such a kind of open, welcoming place. So one particularly interesting thing is that she signs the marriage register Ina, so with her African name. And we get this sense maybe that in and amongst this incredibly British, Victorian, upper-class, sort of high society wedding, she's reasserting her African identity.
These are extraordinary things. I love the pose of the groom here. I mean, it's just brilliant. Who would have seen these photos?
These sort of carte de visites were being mass-produced by the time we're getting to the 1860s. And people would have really loved owning one, this sort of feeling that you've got a tiny bit of celebrity in your own possession. So these definitely were, while they're in some ways relatively intimate portraits, they were definitely for mass consumption.
Well, it's so important that these are in the NPG's collection so that they're here, so that work can be done, so things can be displayed and new dialogues can be made.
Hugely. And I think it is just so important for people to see black people in the past. Obviously, transatlantic slavery is a huge part of that story, but it's really not the only story. We have a whole variety of different lives that we can find out more about through these kind of really arresting images that the National Portrait Gallery holds.
This is a portrait of Julia Margaret Cameron by George Frederick Watts. These are two very important figures, and they beautifully illustrate the point where photography and painting collide and form a dialogue for the first time. Watts is the leading artist of his day. He's interested in things which are romantic and symbolic. And Julia Margaret Cameron is an early pioneer in photography. She gets her first camera only about 10 years after they're invented. Cameron photographs Watts several times, and what she's trying to do is make her photographs like a great painting. They're slightly out of focus. She's not so worried about technical precision, but more the meaning and value of the image. And Watts is a fantastic artistic mentor for her. The fascinating exchange between these two great cultural characters would lay a really important foundation for the interplay that continues between painting and photography today. Next time, I'll be finding out how the Bloomsbury Group dared to live differently at the beginning of the 20th century. I'll discover what made the new Elizabethan portraitists and subjects so special. And as the reopening draws nearer, I'll see firsthand how the National Portrait Gallery is championing work by the next generation of artists.